What's going on YouTube? It's Teej back again with another video, and as promised, I'm going through my updated 2023 QB rankings. I'm going to do this at least one more time, maybe twice before we get to April, but here are my updated QB rankings as we are now into 2023. Before we jump to this, did want to pass on, I'm sure you guys have already heard the updates about Damar Hamlin. Really just such an awesome, turn of events, really such a scary moment last Monday. Now he's, FaceTiming with his teammates. I really can't wait to see what the reaction is when he sees how much his charity has raised, that toy drive. So things are certainly looking up. He's speaking right now. And we also have finalized playoff changes, which, I think Damar Hamlin's the bigger story here, and that's more exciting. I think the playoff changes, I'm almost surprised they didn't go to an 8th team, get rid of the bye week, right, for the 1 seed, because it's one more team, so you're tapping into one more market on both conferences, right? So 2 teams in general, two markets to tap into. One more football game, which I would have assumed would have gone on NFL Network. So it would have been the NFL adding a game, putting it on their TV network. Felt like that was kind of where the NFL was going to go. Maybe I think they're a little too greedy. Maybe I'm, looking in such a pessimistic light. But I do think this change works for the most part. I think the easiest way to have approached it, I do think all 3 teams, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Buffalo, are going to win. And they're the 3 teams that if they win, then you get in the neutral site situation in the AFC Championship game. Unless it's Bills-Bengals, that game is going to be in Buffalo, which I don't really think that's fair to Cincinnati, because that game on Monday, it was 7-3 when the game was canceled, right? Like, that game could have gone any number of ways. To me, the simplest thing the NFL could have done is said, hey, if the AFC Championship game, assuming all 3 teams win here in Week 18, if that happens, if 2 of these 3 teams, in any combination, 2 of these 3 teams are in the AFC Championship game, it goes for a neutral site. To me, that's just the simplest way, as opposed to, like, if this happens, point 1, point 2, point 2A or 2B, and then there's point 3, 3A, 3B, 3C. They made it so much more complicated. If they all win this week, any 2 of those 3 in any combination should have been in a neutral site. But now it's like any combination of Kansas City versus Cincy or Kansas City versus Buffalo. So, okay, I think it's a fair enough way of approaching it. And realistically, the biggest winners here are Indianapolis fans, Atlanta fans, these places that are most likely to be a neutral site, because you had to watch your team all this year. And now, all of a sudden, your city might have perhaps the best game of the NFL season fall into their city's lap. So that's kind of exciting. But I just wish they kind of kept it simple and said, hey, any combination of these 2 teams in the AFC Championship game, it's going to be a neutral site. But since he does get a little bit of a shaft there, they also get it with the Ravens game, because if Baltimore wins, even if since he's the division crown, they get the harder schedule next year, there's a coin toss. But I don't think they'll lose to Tyler Huntley, so it's not really a big deal in my opinion anyways. Now, with all that down, all those updates you already probably know about, just want to give you my thoughts, kind of where I was coming from. I'd love to hear yours down below in the comment section. Let's talk about this 2023 QB class. We'll start with 5 going up to 1. I'm still a big Tanner McKee guy, and he's probably not going to be a first rounder, but somewhere there in the second round, I think a team's going to take a stab at it, right? I look at a guy at Stanford who was under pressure a ton and had the highest percentage of tight window throws, and also had the highest accuracy percentage of tight window throws. So this is a guy that had wide receivers not getting open, an offensive line that really wasn't that good at Stanford. Bad situation. All that to say, I think, obviously this depends on where he gets drafted, but he might be stepping into a better NFL situation than what he had throughout his entire career at Stanford. And I still think the talent's there. He's got good arm strength, an even bigger arm, in my opinion, than someone like a CJ Stroud. Accuracy, like I said, highest percentage of throws accurately fitted into a tight window. And not super mobile, but enough to where, if it's a last resort play, you need 5 or 6 yards, he can tuck and run and do something like that. So I'm still big on Tanner McKee. I think he's a guy that once he gets to the NFL could find himself in a better situation. Some team on day 2 that maybe struck out in that, free agent veteran market, couldn't make a trade happen, didn't get one of the top guys to the NFL draft, like middle of the second round, that guy Tanner McKee in this case, could just fall into your lap, and it might end up being the best thing for you. Like, I could see a situation where Washington is kind of outside looking in, McKee falls into their lap, and maybe that's a good situation, or maybe a Raider, I don't know, or a team that's looking to go bridge quarterback route. Plenty of different scenarios and hypotheticals I could throw at you, but I think Tanner McKee might end up being a really nice find in the second round. And also, Drew Lock didn't turn out good, but I think that process was sound from Denver, where it's like we didn't force the pick in the first round. Lock fell to us at pick 40. Lock didn't end up working out, whatever, but I think the process was sound enough there to where something similar could happen here with Tanner McKee. Then we get to Anthony Richardson, and he's going to go in the first round. I just don't know where, man. I look at, wherever Washington and the Giants pick, the Giants make the playoffs. Washington eliminated. So wherever the Giants are picking 22, 23, 24, I think that's his floor. I really don't think he gets past that, because I do think Brian Daboll, if there's one coach I could pick in the NFL, it might be Brian Daboll to coach up Anthony Richardson. But that said, he might also go way before that. Like, there could be a situation where Carolina, especially if they get a win this week against New Orleans, they might fall to pick 11, 12, 13 for all we know. And they might miss out on the big three. So where Anthony Richardson's there at 12, whatever the situation plays out to be, that might be their best option. So I totally think that he could go top half the first round, and I wouldn't be surprised if he goes top 10. So I think the upside's there, and I've said this a couple times, where it's not Malik Willis like last year, where you see the mobility and you see a big arm, but there's so much that needs to be cleaned up when it comes to his throwing motion, his timing, how to run an offense, how to be a quarterback. Anthony Richardson, I think, has a lot more of those intangibles in place. And there are, like, if you were to pick his 5 best plays from the year, you'd be looking at, and you could convince somebody that the technique's always there. You know, the throwing motion's always pristine. Realistically, though, it's not. And we got to find a way to get Anthony Richardson to a spot where, you know, he's going through that throwing motion without even thinking about it, and it's just, you know, polished. So and this also comes down to having more starting reps, right? You know, like, for whatever reason, he wasn't starting right away once he got to Florida. That's, you know, part of the reason that Billy Napier was hired, right? So some more playing time under his belt, some more work, some more reps, I think will go a long way. But he does come, of the 5 people on this, you know, first list, he has by far the lowest floor to me. Him and Will Levis. I mean, their floor are by far the lowest, but I do think, you know, Levis with his arm strength and his rushing ability, and, you know, a couple of years starter now, I feel a little bit better about Levis. He is obviously, you know, a risk in and of itself, but yeah, I think Richardson probably has the lowest floor of this group. So it is truly a, you know, risk reward proposition here. So part of this is going to come down to great coaching. Like, he's going to need to find himself in a good situation, and that's where, you know, hey, if Carolina, depending on who they hire as a head coach, you know, Anthony Richardson could step into a spot with an emerging offensive line, some decent running backs, DJ Moore, who I like it, you know, if he can find himself in a situation like that, I'm optimistic about what Anthony Richardson can develop into. Then we get to CJ Stroud, and man, the gap between 1 and 2 is pretty sizable in my opinion. And then to me, there was like a half step difference between Will Levis and CJ Stroud, which is crazy because, you know, preseason I had CJ Stroud as the number 1 guy on this list. I was partially projecting. But so let me just start with kind of my major criticism I had of CJ Stroud. You know, PFF grade of like 38 against pressure. He has really struggled against the blitz, under pressure, and specifically when plays break down, he has to go off script. When he has to try to emulate a Patrick Mahomes, a Josh Allen, or something of that nature that we've become so accustomed to seeing at the NFL level. So for me, it's like, yeah, this guy plays in the best offense with awesome targets all around him, including my 2024 wide receiver 1, a guy who would be my number 1 wide receiver in this year's draft class, and Marvin Harrison Jr. You're like, the situation's great, and the offense itself is great. Ohio State as a roster is great. But when things go awry, CJ Stroud does not look like he's up for the task. And then the college football playoff happened, right? And you see what he does to Georgia, specifically in that first half. That first touchdown to Marvin Harrison is exactly what I've been waiting to see. He breaks the pocket, keeps his eyes downfield, looking for his guy. Marvin Harrison spins away from Keely Ringo, gets enough separation. The throw's on the money, touchdown, boom. It's 7-0 Buckeyes. That's the type of play where it's like, okay, if CJ Stroud's going to add that to his toolbox on top of what I know what he looks like in a pristine situation, all right, we got to have something here. And I think he did that multiple times throughout the game. And honestly, like, if you are a CJ Stroud believer, if you are somebody who, I don't think this is a huge camp, but if you're somebody who says CJ Stroud's the best quarterback in this class, or if you're in what I think is a lot larger of a camp, if you think CJ Stroud's the number 2 quarterback in this class, that's the game to look at. Like, that's the game to show people, because I think that's the best game of his career from a draft perspective, because he had to do so much under pressure, 19 snaps under pressure in that game, and he did so much off script, and he did so much outside the pocket. That was the game to try to change people like me and their opinion about CJ Stroud. So, man, he went from a guy where I'm like, yeah, I don't really think he gets outside the top 10 despite his flaws, to where it's like, man, I'm thinking about for my next mock draft, Arizona's there at 4, let's just say they are. They're a team that has so many holes in the roster, depending on who they hire as head coach. Maybe they trade back, and somebody's moving up to 4 to get a CJ Stroud, to get a Will Levis, and that leaves Indianapolis potentially there at 5, or whoever is there, stuck with drafting the other, right? Like, now I think because of how good CJ Stroud looked in that college football playoff game, we go from, you know, pretty safely saying 3 quarterbacks in the top 10 to we might have 3 quarterbacks in the top 5 like we did in 2021. Now that was quarterbacks 1, 2, 3, so I don't think it'll be quite that, but man, yeah, CJ Stroud made this quarterback class a lot more interesting this past weekend. Then we get to Will Levis. I do have Levis, you know, getting the bump over CJ Stroud. I know the production this year was not great, and there's a lot of detractors, a lot of people who don't like Will Levis, and I understand. he is similar to Tanner McKee, where the offensive line was not very good. This team had Calvin Austin enter the NFL draft. So the wide receiver talent took a step back this year. Really the best thing in that Kentucky offense, other than Will Levis, was Chris Rodriguez. And, it's a running back. And it's kind of like when you look at the Titans and it's like, Derrick Henry. But then what's the rest of that off? So it's a little tricky from my perspective. I think Levis, just like a Tanner McKee, once he gets to the NFL, might put himself in a better situation. I was even talking about this in one of my last mock drafts where, hey, let's say the Colts draft Will Levis. He'll have a better offensive line situation. And not just because the NFL players are better than college, but comparatively speaking, looking at the NCAA and the NFL, the Colts offensive line comparatively, I think in a better spot. Wide receivers, a better situation. And you might also end up playing for a coach that is offensive minded as opposed to, Mark Stutz, who, defensive minded head coach, just like his dad, Bob. They want to pound the rock, want to lean on the defense. I think all in all, he might find himself in a better situation at the NFL level, like if it is in Indianapolis or whatever. So I'm a big believer in the traits, the arm strength, the mobility is pretty good. And it's more than a McKee. It's more than a Young in a lot of ways too. Not an Anthony Richardson, but I think it can be utilized in an offense more than a tuck and run type of thing. I think you can build that as a part of the offense and add one more wrinkle into your offensive scheme to try to keep defenses that much more on their toes. So I'm a big believer in what Levis could be. Now, of course, with all that said, he, just like Anthony Richardson, has a pretty low floor. If he does not learn how to become a better decision maker, gets away from trying to force throws. Now, again, I think part of that's the situation in Kentucky. I think he put him in an NFL situation where he's in a better spot. Maybe he's not trying to force those throws. Maybe he's not trying to be Superman and try to win games by himself. I think that's, kind of fair. I almost like it to a different position group here. But Jahmyr Gibbs at Georgia Tech was trying to win games for GT by himself. Transfers to Alabama and he can play within an offense. And next thing you know, he's my number 2 running back. He's my preseason number 2 running back because I thought he would make that leap. And that's what we saw. I think Will Levis could do the same thing at the NFL level. So it's hard to grade the negative in him because I feel like the situation was so corrosive and so bad around him to where he was put into a spot where he had to force a throw. He had to make a bad decision. He had to just try to fit it into a tight window. Those types of things that work against Will Levis. Part of that's because, Kentucky didn't really have a great ecosystem around him. So that's just my take. I'd love to hear yours down below. And then there's Bryce Young at number 1. I mean, did you watch the Sugar Bowl, right? A little slow to start, maybe. But, man, there has not been much you can knock about Bryce Young. I'm comfortable not only saying he's the number 1 quarterback in this class. In my big board, I do account for position value. He will be the number 1 player on my big board for the rest of this cycle. And to me, no matter what happens, even if the Chicago Bears get the number 1 overall pick this weekend, Bryce Young needs to be the number 1 overall pick. Now, Bears fans, don't freak out. I'm not giving up on Justin Fields. Big Justin Fields guy. I just think you're sitting on a king's ransom. Then if you lose and the Texans win this week and you end up getting the number 1 overall pick, you can just trade it with 31 other teams looking at the prospect of Bryce Young. To me, he's got to be the number 1 overall pick. So the Bears, really best case situation for them would be get that number 1 overall pick and trade it and then have someone else draft Bryce Young. But if you're Houston at 1, I mean, this has got to be the pick. I know they'll say, oh, we're going to keep Robson open, we're going to look, we're looking at the entire board. Bryce Young's got to be the guy. I mean, pocket awareness, his escapability in the pocket is so underrated. He's small, and that's going to be the thing that holds against him. But of the quarterbacks in this class, he has the highest PFF grade of throws over the middle of the field and in the intermediate parts of the field, that 10 to 20 yard range. That's normally the weakness for short quarterbacks, but Bryce Young thrives in that spot. He's got a big arm, maybe not a Kyler Murray and maybe not like an Anthony Richardson or Will Levis in this class, but I think even more than a CJ Stroud, and his accuracy is fantastic, just like a Stroud where they can put the ball wherever they want. I just think Bryce Young right now is the complete prospect other than the fact that he's sub 6 foot and he's a little light, but I'm not really worried about that. Without a doubt, Bryce Young, number 1 quarterback in this class. Let's go ahead and flip now. Let's look at some of my honorable mentions. I do have these in order, so where we did 5 up to 1, top down to bottom is in order for me. So I do have Bo Nix. You could call him my QB6. To me, he looked different this year at Oregon. Now, part of that, there's a difference between playing SEC defenses and Big 12 defenses for sure. But I think he just looked more calm. Honestly, every game I watched, he just felt poised at a different degree. He's a little bit of an older prospect. He feels like he's been playing college football for a decade now. But, man, a lot of good throws to tape. And there's also some bad game where like that week 1 game against Georgia is one that every Oregon Duck potential prospect is trying to put behind them. There were some ugly, but all in all, I think this season featured not only higher highs, but more highs than we've seen throughout his entire college football career. He does have that dual threat ability. He is a good runner. He has good size. And he'd be an interesting prospect late day 2, early day 3. Could he be a draft and stash? Somebody, you're planning on being a backup, but you kind of want to see where the development route goes. I could entertain that. Now, again, a little bit of an older prospect, just like my QB7 here, Hendon Hooker, 25. Obviously, the tore ACL toward the end of the season. When is he even available? That's tough. But Nix and Hooker both, and they're both transfers, right? Like Oregon and Tennessee really were the schools that kind of unlocked their full potential and how good they could be at the college level. But, even at Auburn and Virginia Tech, respectively, for Nix and Hooker, there were moments, there were flashes, there were reasons these names were kind of populating potential quarterback rankings in prior draft classes, right? So this was kind of the year where they all put together. Nix, I like the dual threat ability, and I'm a staunch believer if you have a statue quarterback, your backup needs to be somebody who's mobile, one, to be the QB sneak guy potentially, but also just to add the extra wrinkle in your offense where that mobile quarterback comes onto the field and it's like, okay, well now they could run an option out of this, or they could do QB power, or whatever. I think that should be the staple of how every team operates with their quarterback, depth chart, but that is solely my opinion. So minimum, I think Bo Nix is an interesting backup. And then Hendon Hooker, kind of like a Tanner McKee, but a round later. I think Hendon Hooker is probably in that third round conversation for me right now. Man, a Washington, a New York Giants, right? Like, is Daniel Jones having a career year, but I still don't think that's where Daboll wants to go long term. So let's say they don't land a veteran. They don't get one of those round one guys because Anthony Richardson's already off the board, and obviously the top three are gone. They don't want to trade up. They don't, Joe Shane might not want to get rid of assets for the sake of a quarterback. If they take a Hendon Hooker in the third round and then next year things start to get rocky with Daniel Jones, I could see Hendon Hooker being a kind of a Desmond Ridder of sorts for this, organization, or whoever ends up drafting him in that day three conversation, because realistically, you probably drafted him because you missed out on the big free agency trade NFL draft, targets, those jewels of those respective, ways of obtaining a quarterback. So then Hendon Hooker becomes kind of the leftover, but I think he's kind of an interesting one. Ran a really good offense this year. Obviously, Josh Heupel's offense is, going to inflate quarterback play, but he ran at a high level. Ton of college football experience under his belt. He is mobile, can use his legs at a high level. The injury does kind of complicate that, but man, I go back to the Giants because Daboll knows what he wants his offense to be, and Mike Kafka isn't hired as a head coach. If he stays as the OC, he knows what his offense wants to look like, and I can see Hendon Hooker. Again, if it gets rocky with Daniel Jones, he could just be kind of a facilitator. Like, hey, here's the offense, just get the ball out quick. Here's what we're gonna do. This is your assignment, and I could. Maybe he's not a guy who's going to elevate an offense like a Mahomes or an Allen, but I could see him develop into a guy that's like, I can run offense. I can run this offense. I can get the ball out. Like, I can make the throws where they need to go. That's all really interesting to me. But that being said, if he's going to be that guy, he does need to land at a spot with a good offensive mind and weapons. So even the Giants example, it's like the Daboll component of that, but is he going to be throwing to Richie James? Like, what are we doing there? Or maybe a Jordan Addison if they draft in the first round. So, and I am using the Giants solely as just one example. Take your pick. Like, any team that you think might be potentially looking at a quarterback this offseason, there are going to be 2 or 3 teams that get left out to dry and do not get a Derek Carr. Don't land a Jimmy Garoppolo. Don't get the draft of Levis, Stroud, Young, whatever. And I don't think Rodgers ends up leaving. So maybe Brady's available, but that's really the only big free agent quarterback name out there, in my opinion. So, Hendon Hooker becomes kind of appealing there. Then we get to Jaron Hall from BYU, and Jake Haener actually kept him in the exact same spot. Also, let me throw out some honorable mentions here. On top of my honorable mentions here, Max Duggan could be interesting. Stetson Bennett's going to be at the Senior Bowl. I'm intrigued to see what that's all about. He's had a hell of a season. He's a little small, but I think he's, at least, kind of that Jake Fromm, another Georgia quarterback where it's like, hey, we're going to draft this guy in the 6th round. He's going to be our backup quarterback for 4 years. Like, I could see Stetson Bennett totally being that. So he could have been on this list. Max Duggan, especially with his dual threat ability, could have been on this list. Cam Ward from Washington State could have been included here. Jaden Daniels from LSU, nice dual threat ability, really good runner there. He could have been included, but ultimately I decided to go Jaron Hall, Jake Haener, and then Spencer Rattler, who actually all 3 were on my preseason quarterback rankings. So Jaron Hall, maybe not the craziest year at BYU, also an older prospect, going to be 25 his rookie year, but kind of has that special component to his game where off-platform, cross-body, the throws on the run, all the stuff that's like, wow, he's got it. He's there. Now, do I think he's ready to be stepping into a starting role? Not even close. And where I say Hendon Hooker, maybe towards the end of his rookie year, could be, what Ridder is right now for the Falcons. 4 games. Let's just see what this trial run looks like. I don't think that's Jaron Hall. I don't think that's Jake Haener. I don't think that's Spencer Rattler. I think these guys are all drastically different. And in some ways, Jaron Hall could kind of end up being maybe a slightly better Taylor Heineke, where he's just going to take risks, but he actually has the arm strength to kind of make those risks, tangible, right? He does have good escapability, good mobility. I like Jaron Hall, but this QB class after Hendon Hooker takes a pretty steep nosedive. I wouldn't take Hall, Haener, Rattler before, no earlier than the 4th round. But even then, I'm talking about Hendon Hooker being a 3rd rounder. Hall, Hainer, Rattler, Stetson Bennett, that's probably a 6th round guy. Dugan, 6th, 7th round. Cam Ward, Jaden Daniels, same range. So, all these honorable mentions to the honorable mentions, but then Hall, Hainer, Rattler, I'm thinking mid day 3. Jake Hainer, he's kind of an interesting one. So where I say Jaron Hall could maybe be like a Taylor Heineke with the arm strength, Jake Hainer could kind of be like a Bailey Zappi-ish type of guy, to where if that's your offense, I think he makes sense as your backup, right? So if you have this offense that needs that big arm guy, Jaron Hall might be your dude. But if you're, this West Coast, you can pepper the ball underneath and you're looking at a backup option, Jake Hainer is kind of interesting. I mean, put up some gaudy numbers at Fresno State. Sure, maybe the efficiency and it didn't look as good this year at Fresno State. Maybe they did take a step back this season. But I still think a lot of the same, traits that made him maybe a day 3 guy last year are still there. Maybe not the biggest guy, not the largest arm either, but dude gets the ball out quick, has a good release too, and that's the biggest thing, is he can get the ball out quick. Literally not just like decision making, but the ball gets out of his hand in a quick, timely manner. Good accuracy, a little bit of mobility. I just, I could see this guy being a backup for half decade to decade just because he does the little things right? So, I kind of like Jake Hainer there as that, day 3 backup option, and a cheap one at that. Obviously, that's why you draft him in, day 3. And then Spencer Rattler, man, he's such a confusing and hard prospect to nail down, right? Obviously, we saw some insane highs at Oklahoma. We also saw some super low valleys at Oklahoma. And this year in South Carolina was up and down, right? There's some huge games, right? Like they beat Tennessee and he looked great. And even the last couple games of the regular season, he had some big throws in there, and he made some special throws that are like, okay, there's Spencer Rattler. All right, I see you, kid. The bowl game against Notre Dame. I'm a Fighting Irish fan. I was watching that one, biting my nails all the way through. He had some throws in there too. So like you kind of saw the entire Spencer Rattler experience this season in South Carolina, where there's like some moments where your jaw hits the floor, and there's some moments where your forehead hits your palm. So again, he's really tough to grade, but I think he's worth a day 3 shot, right? If you're a team that, again, not in love with your quarterback situation, or maybe has an older guy that you're trying to plan for the future, and Spencer Rattler steering the face the 5th, 6th round, what do you have to lose? But then think about how much you could gain out of that. So he's definitely a risk-reward proposition, but he comes not with a 1st round, tag attached to him like Will Levis. Will Levis is the top 5 pick potentially, or an Anthony Richardson, who's potentially a top 10 pick, right? So I think he comes without a little bit of the major drawbacks and the major potential failures that come out of, using that risk on a 1st rounder. So Rattler to me is still very interesting. A number of tangents I went down here on my honorable mentions. I do apologize for that, but that is going to do it for my updated 2023 QB rankings. Tell me what you think about this class. Who do you have 1 through 5? Love to hear your thoughts, and who are the names that weren't on this list that should have been. I'd love to hear your take down below in the comments section. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. If you're new around here, seriously, it would mean the world to me if you hit that big red subscribe button and stick with us through draft season. But that is going to do it for me. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And until next time, my name is Tej, and I'm signing off.